Good afternoon. I guess it's afternoon by now. My name is Richard Burke. I'm an emeritus professor here at Penn. I've done a lot of work on AI. I'm your moderator, which means that I don't do very much more than what I'm doing right now. I want to give thanks to some of the people who have helped make this possible. This particular gathering today is part of a year-long series on AI and climate change. It's organized by the Penn Program on Regulation that's in the law school. And it's made possible by funding from Penn's Environmental Innovations Initiative. The Kleinman Center has generously provided space and is a co-sponsor. Additional co-sponsors include the Center for Technology, Innovation and Competition, the Warren Center for Network and Data Sciences, and the Wharton Climate Center. I should let you know that this is being recorded so that it'll be available subsequently at the YouTube channel for the Penn Program on Regulations. Okay. Our speaker today is Dr. Amy Braverman. She's the principal research scientist at the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena. The Jet Propulsion Lab is a national lab, much like Los Alamos. It's played significantly in media of late in Pasadena, California. She's a doctorate in statistics from UCLA and has been at JPL for over 2 decades. She's received many awards and much recognition. She's an elected fellow of the American Statistical Association and also has received the NASA Exceptional Public Service Medal recently in 2022. Professor Braverman has worked on many topics. I've known her for quite some time. They seem to be focused largely on remote sensing, which you'll hear a lot about today, which is basically data collected from satellites. Has lots of opportunities inherent in it, but also lots of challenges. And she's been working on climate change with those sorts of data for quite a while now. On the matter of AI, I should stay at the get-go. There's no scientific consensus on what AI is. There are lots of opinions, but generally speaking, when people who are practitioners who actually use the tools that are called AI, they refer to a bundle of research tools, either in statistics or computer science, that people routinely use for unstructured problems and seem to work pretty well. But if you ask for a boundary, what's AI and what's not, there's considerable disagreement. Today, you're going to see a case study of the application of AI with remote sensing data and climate. And with that, I think I can turn the microphone over. She's mic'd already to Amy. On the matter of questions, it's a big group. This is a big room. There will be lots of time for questions at the end. If there's something that you really have to ask for clarification while the talk is going on, raise your hand. We'll see if we can accommodate you. But it'd be much easier if you can hold that question until the end, and there'll be probably 40 minutes or so for questions and discussion. We want to get as many of you involved as possible. Okay.
Thank you, Richard. Can you guys hear me? Is the mic going? Great. Put that down. Well, thank you very much for coming today. And thank you to the powers that be for inviting me. I was actually supposed to be here last week, but I had an unanticipated encounter with COVID, which is unfortunate. And I thought about coming anyway, but I thought, no, probably don't want to, infect everybody on the airplane and so on. So thanks for showing up today. That's great. Thank you, Richard, for the generous introduction. It's great to be in Philadelphia. I grew up in Philadelphia, moved to the East when I was just after college. I went to Swarthmore, which is one of the local schools. So here's a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about today. When Richard brought up the possibility of coming to talk to you, I was particularly keen to come, largely because I don't consider myself much of an AI expert, although by Richard's definition, maybe I am. But I want to use it as an opportunity to learn something about the role of AI in analyzing the kind of data that we collect at JPL. NASA's business is building and flying spacecraft to observe nature, and mostly historically that's been the solar system and the universe and planets like that. But over the last 2 decades, JPL has gotten much more involved in Earth science, and now about 1/3 of our work comes from these Earth orbiting satellites. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about climate data, a little bit about what I learned about AI preparing for this talk, then talk to you about the application of AI to remote sensing data, and in particular, a new mission that's coming up called Surface Biology and Geology, which is not a very creative name, but that's the best they could do. But I want to start off with a little movie about the upcoming Earth System Observatory, which I will in 1 second. So we're really at the cusp of a new era in Earth remote sensing right now. In 1999, NASA launched the first of 3 satellites that were named Terra, Aqua, and Aura, which comprise something called the Earth Observing System. And they've been up for almost 25 years now, collecting what at the time seemed like huge amounts of data, but don't seem like that huge amount of data anymore, where these are brought down and stored in things called DACs, Distributed Active Archive Centers. Think about that for a minute. Distributed Active Archive Center is the biggest oxymoron that anyone ever invented for an acronym. And most of those data were at kilometers to tens of kilometers spatial scale, and there's about 80 terabytes worth in these DACs as of now. Those satellites are reaching the end of their lives now, and there's a new generation of satellites that are about to be launched over the next 5 to 10 years, and those are called the Earth System Observatory. So don't get confused. The old one was EOS, and the new one is ESO. And there's 4 new missions in the ESO. The first one is going to be launched in January of 24. It's called NISAR. SBG, or Surface Biology and Geology, is one that's coming along closer to the end of the decade. That's the one I know the most about, but people anticipate that by 2030, there will be about 320 petabytes of data in the NASA archive, which is quite a big jump from 80 terabytes. I think the biggest thing here is going to be that the spatial resolution of the Earth System Observatory missions is very high, 30 meters over land, 60 meters over ocean. Compare that to 1 kilometer at best for the EOS missions. And all the data is going to be stored in the cloud. And I should say that all data, all NASA data, are freely available to anyone in the world who wants it. All you have to do is figure out how to go to these DACs or how to go to the Earth Data Cloud to get it. So anything I talk about today, you'll be able to go and get in 5 years when the mission flies. So let's go to the movie now.
As NASA prepares to send humans to the moon and Mars, and peer even deeper into the universe, we turn with a renewed focus to our home planet of Earth. The next generation of Earth science begins with the new Earth System Observatory. The core of the observatory is an array of 5 new satellite missions that will study the atmosphere, the ground, and even what's happening underneath the surface.
These spacecraft will look at the Earth, each one of them their own way, and will integrate all the data in a common approach.
Taken together as a single observatory, we will have a complete 3-dimensional understanding of our Earth systems, how they work together, how one change can influence another. It will watch our planet change, driving solutions for better living, managing water and food resources, predicting natural hazards, coping with sea level rise in coastal communities and heat islands in our cities.
Every 10 years, the best scientists in the United States and worldwide come together and create a strategy, the decadal strategy. And it recommended that we build missions that together form an Earth System Observatory.
We're going to be looking at processes at the microphysical scale, at the large kind of convective scale, at the smaller scale in the oceans, and we're going to be investigating those, pulling that out, encapsulating that, putting that into weather models and climate models, and those are going to allow us to predict and project the future with far more confidence.
We can, from space, help farmers. We can help others that grow food around the Earth.
If there is an earthquake, we can get our models better, and from there we can predict better also in the future.
We can monitor fresh water both on the surface and underground to help water managers, both for communities as well as agriculture.
To build the observatory, we will expand our partnerships with commercial companies and international space agencies to take advantage of innovation and new technology.
We recognize, because of the global nature of the issues at hand, we want international partners to be part of that also. We're working together, and the science that we're doing has to serve all of us.
NICEAR is our first major partnership with the Indian Space Agency in Earth science. It brings together two different kinds of radar systems that together will see changes in our Earth's surface that will help us predict natural hazards in the future.
The NICEAR mission will measure changes in Earth's surface less than a centimeter across. It will measure the movement of glaciers and ice sheets, the dynamics of earthquakes and volcanoes, and changes in farmland.
We will observe the Earth every 12 days exactly at the right repeat pass orbit. We can study small changes in the Earth system sciences.
The Earth's climate is changing. We have documented the changes that we're seeing over the last few decades. We know that it's being driven by human activities, and it's absolutely essential that we continue to understand what's happening, what's changing, in order to better predict what's going to happen and perhaps help people make better choices.
Understanding how our planet and its climate are changing is the foundation for a more resilient and sustainable future. NASA's Earth System Observatory is the next step in this ongoing mission, a mission to the only planet we can call home.
Okay, so that's inspiring, right? That's nobody does eye candy like NASA, let me tell you. Okay, so when I was invited to come to talk about in a seminar series on AI and climate change, I figured I better do a little bit of research on what's AI. And like many of you, I went straight to Wikipedia, and I learned a couple of interesting things. I learned that originally, way back when, the first notion of AI came up, it was thought to be about mimicking human reasoning, which is quite ambitious and proved to be very, very, very hard, right? And I don't think anybody would say that we have achieved human level reasoning, even now, 50 years after the fact. Quick history. These are the important dates that I picked out that I thought were sort of if I was going to give a 2-minute encapsulation of the history of AI, here's what I got. 1930s and 40s, people got the idea that we might be able to formulate mathematical models for the way the human brain works. In 1950, Alan Turing proposed something called the Turing test, which suggested that you would have achieved AI if you could sit opposite at a table that had a blinder where you didn't know who was on the other side, and you would be unable to tell the difference whether you were talking to a human or talking to an AI machine. Very ambitious. The first academic workshop on AI was this Dartmouth workshop organized in 1956. It's the first time people used the term AI. In 1965, a gentleman named Harold Simon, who is a very distinguished researcher in the area of complexity theory, stated that machines will be capable within 20 years of doing any work a man can do, or a woman, some of us would like to think, but that didn't turn out to be true. Then there was something called the first AI winter in the 1970s, where I think funding sort of dried up because the thing called AI had failed to meet the promise of any of those previous ideas. This is the one that really caught me. This is a quote from a woman named Pamela McCorduck. AI researchers were beginning to suspect, reluctantly, for it violated the scientific canon of parsimony, that intelligence might very well be based on the ability to use large amounts of diverse knowledge in different ways. So that's the first time you see something where people are explicitly looking at vast amounts of data as the key to making AI work. And that really stuck to me, especially in the wake of things like ChatGPT, which sort of seems human sometimes because it can access so much information. There was a second AI winter, and then if any of you are old enough, it doesn't look like you mostly are, to remember data mining and knowledge discovery, which sort of harkens back to this idea of being able to exploit very, very large amounts of data. I lived it, so I remember it quite well. Later in the 1990s, probabilistic decision theory and economics were brought in to inject the notion of capturing uncertainty, or that there was uncertainty in the data that is being exploited. And then in the 2010s, we have the rise of deep learning, right? Which we're still in, I think. Okay, point number 2, I found this little graphic at this website about the uses of AI to combat climate change. And I focused, drew red boxes around those elements of this matrix that seemed to me to be suitable where you would want to apply AI to remote sensing data. Remote sensing data are, in my view, a vast untapped resource in completing our knowledge about climate change and climate processes, because no one can really use all of it the way Pamela McCorduck was suggesting. And I particularly drew a bold red box around this one here, which is gather, complete, and process data, satellite and Internet of Things, filling gaps in temporally and spatially sparse data. Those are more traditional sorts of ways in which AI and machine learning and statistics have been brought to bear on satellite data. And it's what pops to my mind first when I think of what would I do with AI of climate change. Well, I'd apply it to this gigantic repository of historical and current data to learn things about how Earth's system processes work. That's kind of a very scientifically oriented thing. And I guess it came as a little bit of a surprise to me that there are all these other applications of AI to the climate problem. But having said that, I'm going to focus on the lower left there. So I'll tell you a little bit about remote sensing from space now, okay? It's not too big a challenge, and I may not talk about everything on every slide that I have here, but I wanted to give you the idea. The basic idea, remote sensing is observing from afar, like you would do by mounting an instrument on a spacecraft. All these instruments do is count photons in different regions of the electromagnetic spectrum. So you typically have a detector that has an across the field of view. So as the satellite's flying this way, across the field of view, there's an array of detectors that discretize the geography across the field of view into little pixels. And then within each of those pixels, there's another detector that figures out the energy of arriving photons and throws them into bins. So you've discretized the electromagnetic spectrum, and you're counting photons in different regions of the electromagnetic spectrum that arose presumably from these pixels on the ground. The sun, in passive remote sensing, the sun provides incoming photons. which are scattered and absorbed by ways that are characteristic of the media that they pass through or that they encounter. So that's through the atmosphere, that's they hit the ground, they get bounced back out some of them get bounced back out, some of them are absorbed, they go through the atmosphere again and are either scattered or absorbed, and then some of those photons arrive back at the satellite and are subjected to this spectral binning procedure. It's also true that some media, like some surface types, will emit photons just because let's say they're warm. And so trying to untangle all of that and figure out what these spectra have to tell you about the process, the geophysical process that you're interested in, is a very complicated procedure. So let's look a little bit more at that. So here's a cartoon. The observer is our satellite, it's flying along. Photons come in from the sun, as shown by the red line there. They encounter the atmosphere. There are little particles in the atmosphere called aerosols that might scatter or absorb some of the photons. There are molecules in the atmosphere, or things like carbon dioxide, that will scatter or absorb in characteristic ways. But some of those photons will reach the ground and interact with the ground in a similar way, and then get bounced back up to the satellite. So if you're starting to get the idea that keeping track of all of that at the photon level is really, really, really complicated, you're getting the right idea. So this is what typically happens. Remember, I said you've got this array of detectors, the spacecraft is flying this way. This little cartoon here by my friend David Thompson sort of shows what happens. And typically what you get is, for every physical pixel on the ground, you get a vector or a collection of numbers that are what we call a spectrum, or a vector of radiances, they're called, simply showing, looks like something like this, this diagram right here, showing the characteristic jumps and wiggles in all these different electromagnetic spectral bins. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about that. It's at that level, it is complicated. It relies on a branch of physics called radiative transfer, which is the physics of how photons are scattered and absorbed by different things. When we do this at NASA, we are typically on a spacecraft that might be orbiting the Earth in polar orbit, which means going from pole to pole, going this way, like that. And as it's going like this, the Earth is turning underneath. So you're getting this sort of striped basketball kind of coverage of the Earth, faster if the width of the horizontal field of view is wide, and slower, you're getting thinner strips if it's narrow. These data are dumped down in chunks from the spacecraft, and this is what we call level 0 data, which is raw photon counts directly from the satellite. Then there's a gigantic data processing chain that takes place. The first thing that has to happen is you have to know where each of those footprints actually was on the ground. That's called georectification. And then you have to calibrate the radiances, because different detectors sometimes drift or are off a little bit. They're not all exactly the same. You have to do a lot of work to do that. And then the real fun starts once you've got that, where we produce something called level 2 data. And this is the inference problem that is inherent in remote sensing, which is you get to see this spectrum, and you want to infer from that spectrum the properties of the target physical process that gave rise to the atmosphere or the Earth's surface or whatever's happening there. This is called a retrieval. You're going to retrieve the state from these noisy radiance vectors. That's essentially always seemed to me, that's a statistics problem, really. And many of my friends actually want to treat it like a physics problem because of the complexity of the physics of radiative transfer. But it really, I mean, in truth, it requires knowledge from both sides. These data sets tend to be very large. So NASA has mandated that we produce these gridded summaries, where you just chop up the Earth in little 1 degree by 1 degree grid cells, and you put the mean value of whatever retrieved variable you're interested in that cell. And maybe if you're really good, you also put the standard deviation in there. And then level 4 is just ways in which the level 2 and level 3 data can be used to drive data assimilation models or combined with model knowledge, which is often used to fill in gaps or to transfer the knowledge from those level 2 or level 3 data sets into a realm that is of greater interest, something like where's the carbon coming from the Earth's surface. That's not something we can observe directly, but we can observe carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere at different places. Those are two different things. The second thing would have to be inferred. Now, the punchline here is the big thing in red. I'm a statistician, and to me, these level 2 geophysical state data aren't really data at all. They're not unvarnished observations from nature. They are themselves the product of inferences. All right, conceptual model of what I just, to flesh it out just a little bit. This is my cartoon of how a remote sensing observing system works. The things in gray are things we don't actually get to see, but we know they're out there. So the true state of nature, I'm calling that X. You don't even have to worry about the symbols that are there. True state of nature, nature does something. That something has a consequence for what the radiative properties are that our instrument is trying to observe. But our instrument don't see those radiances absolutely purely because there's measurement error. So what we actually get to see starts over here with the observation Y, which is what I'm calling the radiance vector that the instrument actually sees. Then comes the big ground dump, then comes the big processing chain that ultimately results in estimates of what the state variable is. So if the state variable is concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there's a real true value of concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then there's what we estimate after our long chain of processing. And I'm just putting a hat on the estimate to distinguish it from the true thing. All right, now I'm going to switch gears a little bit to one of the ESO missions that they did not talk about specifically. I talked a lot about NISAR because that's the radar mission that's going up in January. So that's the first one. This one is called Surface Biology and Geology. Every 10 years, like they said in the video, the National Academy puts together a committee to tell NASA, NOAA, and the USGS what it should do for the next 10 years, what it should observe. And this time around, they identified what they called designated observables. Rather than telling us you should fly this mission and that mission and that mission, they said you should observe this, this, and this. And one of the so-called designated observables were properties of the surface biology and geology. And no one has yet to come up with a more clever name for this mission than SBG. So that's what it is. SBG is actually two platforms flying in tandem, one of which observes in one part of the electromagnetic spectrum called the visible shortwave, infrared, and the other one observes in the thermal, which is a completely different part of the electromagnetic spectrum. They're good for different things. There are some things that they're both good for and some things that only one of them is good for. We'll get to that in a minute. I think the key thing here is this little summary. Don't worry about the details in there, but the VSWARE instrument is going to observe at 30-meter resolution globally, and the thermal instrument is going to observe at 60-meter resolution globally. And if you think about that, globally, I mean, that's a huge ton of data, right? As much as 5 terabytes of data just from the radiances, just from the spectrum that are being observed every day, not to mention all the additional products that are going to be generated by doing these so-called retrievals. Okay, so key science and application areas where these data are expected to be important: active surface changes, snow and ice accumulation. Snow and ice are really, really important for the Earth's energy balance, just some of you might know, because the bright surface that is snow and ice will tend to bounce photons back out instead of absorbing them. So that's a key scientific area of interest, is what is the impact? How is snow and ice coverage changing, and what's its impact on the radiative balance of the Earth system? Hazards in rugged topography, effects of changing land use on surface energy, water momentum, and carbon fluxes. The physiology of primary producers. If you don't know what a primary producer is, I didn't. Primary producer, we're talking about plants. Understanding the growth cycle of plants, their plants' ability to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, This is important for agriculture and for resource management, as well as for biodiversity. Let's see, functional traits and health of terrestrial vegetation in inland and near coastal aquatic ecosystems. So there's also going to be observations over the coasts, where the problem becomes even more complicated from a radiative transfer point of view, because now you're trying to understand, you not only have to account for the photons as they interact with the atmosphere, you also have to account for photons as they interact with the water column as they travel down to the bottom of whatever it is, the bottom of the coastal area, and then bounce back. So it's really, really hard. So there are lots. The point of this slide, without going into great detail, is that at 30-meter spatial resolution, for data that cover all these different areas, these different problem areas, there should be a lot of utility and a lot of opportunity for AI and related methods to exploit these data. So this is just a little bit more giving you an idea. I mean, here's what you get, for ecosystems over there. Those are a bunch of typical, what we call surface reflectances from the ecosystems. One primary challenge with these data is because we're interested in surface properties, that big retrieval data processing step has to include removing the impact of whatever happened in the atmosphere. And that's a very challenging problem. And so the difference between the radiance spectrum that the satellite sees and what we call a surface reflectance is that the surface reflectance has been adjusted to try to remove the impact of the atmosphere. Okay, so what's new here? It's a huge increase in data volume, a huge increase in data spatial resolution. These data from SBG will be specifically intended for societal applications as well as science, as well as scientific analysis right from the outset. Societal benefit and things like that had been a little bit of an afterthought with the Earth Observing System missions. It was only after NASA got on board with the idea that we need to do a better job of helping people understand why we need to fly these missions and how it can impact their daily lives, that this became a thing, applications, and now it's a huge thing. The biggest difference here, owing to the increase in volume and resolution, is that I like to say these data will provide us with information about local and fine scale behaviors, but on a global scale. And I actually had a conversation with Richard about this beforehand. He said, well, what does that mean? So I came up with a few examples. How is agricultural scale evapotranspiration affected by soil moisture and temperature? Okay, so agricultural field spatial resolution is multiple of these 30-meter pixels. If you have data from all different kinds of agricultural fields from all over the world, because agriculture isn't the same everywhere, and you could interrogate all of that, you would learn a lot more than what you would do if you did either of the things we can do now. We have two choices these days. One is you do this gridding thing, where you essentially reduce the resolution of the data set by averaging. And if you are a stat nerd, you know that averaging reduces information. And I think everybody can probably appreciate that. You're going to replace everything that's going on in, let's say, this 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer box with the average of everything that goes on in the box. You're losing a ton, right? Especially if you're talking of agricultural fields where there's lots of different kinds of things going on. So asking how temperature and soil moisture is affected by averaging first and then doing your analysis, you're inherently losing information and are very likely to get some different answer or not as nuanced an answer. The other thing you can do, which is most of what people do when they have questions like this, is just go and grab small subsets of the data. So maybe I could go around the world and I could grab small subsets of every different kind of agricultural field that there is, and then do this analysis, label this one is a rice paddy, this one is a cornfield. If I could do it that way, and if I could do it globally, if I could do it for every different kind of field, then I would be doing something different, right? But I can't actually do that. Nobody can do that. right? So, but these data would allow us, if we could figure out how to analyze the data in a way, using AI, let's say, that gives us information about this dependency of evapotranspiration on soil moisture and temperature. If I had an automated way to do that, then I could do that on the entire world. So that's what I mean by that, because geophysical processes are different depending what spatial resolution you investigate them at. And so if you can get down to a very fine resolution, you're going to get different kinds of answers. You're going to get different information than if you have to do it at a coarse resolution. Can we predict landslides from lag, fractional snow cover, and mineral composition? You would kind of hope so. I mean, at least that would be something, right? But again, you don't know ahead of time where there's going to be a landslide. You're only going to be able to go back in time after in order to try to learn the mechanistic dependency of landslides on these things. And if you only know to look where it's already happened, then you're never going to be able to look at similar places where it hasn't happened, right? So, and here's one for maybe this crowd a little bit. Does the extent of urban green space correlate with temperature? Probably. But these data at 30-meter resolution are probably going to, for the first time, open up the ability to ask these kinds of questions for problems like urban landscapes. 30 meters is probably good for that. A whole kilometer, 10 kilometers, not so much. Then you have to do the averaging thing. So we need to do more than just subset the data and look at specific cases or decimate the data with averaging. And that's what the promise of AI is with these data. So I decided I would go look at some examples of what kinds of AI people at NASA are doing now that might be instructive about telling us where we might go in the future with AI. And so I came up with 3 examples. This one I picked out. This is, I believe, counting trees. Is that what it is, or is this clouds? This might be the clouds example. So I was particularly interested in this because you probably can't read that, but I'll read it to you. It says, artificial intelligence, this is from a NASA website, refers to the simulation of human decision-making capabilities in machines. Machine learning is a subfield of AI that uses statistics and mathematical models to detect patterns in data. When applied to big data collections, such as NASA Earth observing data, AI and ML can be used to sift through years of data and imagery rapidly and efficiently to find relationships that would be impossible for a human to detect. NASA's Earth Science Data System program is committed to the use of AI and recognizes its potential to significantly advance existing data system capabilities, improve operations, and maximize the use of Earth observing data. So I like that, actually, because it doesn't claim magic, right? And it does say, it harkens back to this human-like reasoning idea, right? And it says specifically that machine learning is a subfield of AI, which I think is probably true. That's a good way to put it. It's not all of AI. People, in my experience, tend to use ML as if it's a synonym for AI, and I don't think that's true, and apparently neither do they, which is a good thing. Pattern finding here is what they seem to be suggesting that these methods are good at now. And this little example, I believe this is cloud imagery. I apologize, that's really, really tiny. Hadn't realized that that would be so tiny, but it is. People for the same reasons that people care about the distribution of snow and ice on Earth, they also care very much about clouds, right? Clouds also have different optical properties and have an effect on the photons that are scattered back to space without getting into Earth. People care about what the linkage is between different kinds of cloud fields and cloud processes and other geophysical processes in the atmosphere and on the ground. Aerosols being a particular one. There's a whole huge scientific domain devoted to what's the interaction between clouds, which are water particles, and aerosols, which are other kinds of particles. Looking, if you've ever been in an airplane, which most of you probably have, you look down, you can definitely see that there are different kinds of clouds and different kinds of patterns over different areas. So you can imagine that probably a basic use of machine learning here is to say, what are the prototypical kinds of cloud fields that we see and where do they occur. So some kind of clustering method that might segment an image into different parts depending on the cloud field. And then for a new cloud image that you might get, for it to identify which of those typical types it is, that would be something you do. People also care a lot about clouds in climate models because climate models run at that coarser resolution, and nobody can actually represent clouds in a climate model through physics because the processes occur on small scales. People use what are called parameterizations, which are statistical representations of what's happening within that half-degree by half-degree grid cell. So having data at much higher resolution and being able to interrogate them in this sort of way is something that people who build those parameterizations will be very, very interested in. Now, SPG is not going to observe the atmosphere, although there are some people working on whether it could, on whether you could, for example, get methane content from atmospheric retrievals using the SPG data, but that's not its primary target. Okay. Did I just miss one? Nope, I didn't. Okay, so this is the tree counting one. This one says counting trees in Africa's drylands. Trees play a vital role in the carbon and water cycles of sub-Saharan Africa. They also contribute food, firewood, and medicine to people living in the region. A new study led by an international team of scientists used artificial intelligence to identify an unexpectedly large number of trees across arid and semi-arid areas of West Africa. These drylands were previously thought to have little or no tree cover, and the study will help scientists understand the role drylands have in the global carbon cycle. So that's interesting. That's something that you would learn from remote sensing that you wouldn't learn by going out and looking, because nobody could walk all over sub-Saharan Africa. But who knew? There are places where there are lots of trees and people didn't think there were. So that's a new thing. I went and actually looked at this little study here. The artificial intelligence here was having people hand label what's a tree and what's not a tree in some test images, and then applying a machine learning algorithm that was capable of processing new images to say how many trees are in the image. So that's why I say so far it's pattern finding, which is fine, but it's not entirely pattern finding. This is one, I think, no, this is not one that some of my colleagues worked on at JPL, although they did something in the similar area. This is tropical cyclone intensity estimation using a deep convolutional neural network. So this is an interesting one. If you go to this website that's listed at the bottom, you can play around with this, and it's quite fun. There's a time slider along the bottom, and you can go to different places and see where this hurricane is expected to be at different times along its trajectory. And it, of course, yeah, you can do that for the past history, that's fine. But it's more fun to do it for hurricanes that are out there right now. And that's kind of interesting because it gives you this cone, this discolored cone of uncertainty about where it thinks it's going to go. This was Tropical Storm Felipe in the Caribbean at 9 a.m. on October 1st, 2023. So that was fairly recent. It was current at the time I was trying to put this talk together. So there are different applications of AI. It is mostly pattern finding, but this temporal prediction, this idea of saying, where's a hurricane going to go? That's a really good example of a place where you might expect these kinds of AI techniques to work pretty well, because you do have a historical library, and they do, being natural phenomena, follow certain kind of patterns. So in a sense, it is pattern finding. It's like saying, if I find a new hurricane that has certain characteristics in common with a bunch of older hurricanes that are in my library, and those older hurricanes did X, then I might expect that this hurricane that I'm looking at now would do X. So I'm flying here, I'm doing well. Okay, so here's a summary. Full exploitation of NASA's Earth science data, past, present, and future, demands things like AI and ML. If all we're gonna do is park these data sets in what affectionately is called the data morgue, where no one ever looks at them again, then it's kind of hard to justify spending the billions of dollars we're spending to get them. We need ways to interrogate these data sets in a way that lets us discover things and predict things, not just say, ooh, there was a volcanic eruption on this day. Did my orbiting instruments see it and go back and look? No, we want to be able to ask the question, were there any volcanic eruptions today? And if so, where were they and how big were they? Those are the kinds of questions we want to be able to answer. The use of AI and ML is what I would say is still at what I would call an exploratory stage right now. None of the examples that I saw did formal statistical inference on their conclusions. And that may not be so much due to the AI and the ML as it is to the lack of formal uncertainties on many of these data products. Now, that I was telling Dick earlier today, that's something we've been working very hard on for about a decade at JPL. And with the SBG mission, they have bought into the idea that we need to formulate a way not only to put out the data, but also to provide uncertainties on those data points, right? We have our retrieval algorithm is producing an inferred estimate of the physical state. We need that, and we need some understanding of how sure we are about that answer. So we are working on that. But as far as past data sets go, they don't generally have that. Sometimes they have things called quality flags on them, which are sort of a terrible thing that gives you a number like 0, 1, 2, and 3. Like 0 is don't use this no matter what you do. 1 is, well, if you have low standards, you can use this. And 2 is if you have medium standards, you can use this. And 3 is use this and only this if you have very high standards for your data. But there's not usually a good quantitative representation of what that means. So I see heads nodding. People must know. People must have some experience with this. The big reminder, geophysical data are not really statistician level data. They are inferred. There are lots of assumptions. That's another plug for why we need the uncertainties to be part of it. Most of the ML work do not account for uncertainties in the data. ML typically produces point predictions. You give me a new instance of, let's say, a spectrum from an instrument, and I will give you a new point estimate of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. But while there is research that's going on in the area of how you would put uncertainties onto outputs like that, it's, in my opinion, not terribly compelling at this point. It's an interesting problem how to do that. I think machine learning actually needs statisticians and statistics in order to figure out how to do that well. But I'm biased, I'm a statistician. So my last summary point is that it's a long way from machine learning, automated learning, to AI, automated reasoning. And we're just at the beginning. So I do bristle a bit when people talk about AI when they really mean machine learning. I think it's important to keep those two things separate. The reasoning part is a long way off yet, no matter how good you think GPT is. Okay, so here are some questions for discussion, maybe. NASA has always had more data than it could explore. That's just the nature of the game, because it's always easier to collect data than it is to analyze it. So there's always going to be more data than you can actually deal with on your computer. And it was popular at one point for people to say, just wait a few years, the computers will catch up. Well, no, they won't, because the faster the computer gets, the more data there's going to be. So there's always going to be more data than can be understood. I'll come back to this point again one more time. These data can illuminate these fine scale, actually multi-scale behaviors in the climate system over global domains, leading to new insights about the mechanisms that cause them and greater predictive power. That's probably the big one. The potential is for understanding these local scale phenomena, but using global scale data to illuminate them. With the new ESO project, we have a quantum leap in spatial resolution, which provides the possibility of a whole new levels of process understanding, particularly in ecology, which is the area I'm most familiar with for SBG, where people are really interested in the time evolution of certain properties of plants at faster temporal resolutions and finer spatial resolutions than they could ever get at. You know, when you're observing at 1 kilometer resolution, all you're talking about there is trying to say something about the average behavior of a particular species over that 1 kilometer region. If you're looking at a 30 kilometer region, maybe it's all pine trees. Maybe it's all the same kind of pine tree. You can really say something about that. AI, and I learned this from talking to Richard here. I sort of thought of this, that it's kind of an ultra flexible structure for learning intricate empirical models. And that really is something, you know, to have figured out how you can, to be in a case where you, normally we postulate a model in statistics and then we use data to estimate the parameters of that model. Well, here they're kind of backing it up a level and saying, by learning the parameters with the data, it's going to define a kind of a model for you that you can use to make predictions. And it is quite an achievement, but I also think it's been oversold for what it can do. And all that is by way of just saying we need more people, particularly graduate students and postdocs and young folks who are interested in these ideas and are willing to try to bring them together. So that means not just being an expert in science or an expert in machine learning or AI or statistics or any of those things, but it means people who are willing to be experts at the intersection of those areas, because it's only then that we're going to get the kind of insight that we need in order to exploit these methods in a way that's going to reveal new scientific insights. So you can be self-taught like me. You can get your degree in statistics and be self-taught from hanging around with your friends who are ecologists. Or you could maybe study both ecology and statistics, or both ecology and machine learning together, and really hone in on what the machine learning or the AI can provide to the science. So that is what I'm going to stop with. Thanks.
I've got to figure out how to make this thing work. I think it is. We now have a substantial amount of time for questions. They can be clarifying. They can also be challenging if that's your style. And the way we're going to proceed is that raise your hand. I'll point. There are people around the periphery who have microphones that'll bring you a microphone, and you can ask questions directed at Professor Dr. Braverman. So, questions. Carrie, you get seniority privilege.
That was probably easier. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Braverman, for being here. Welcome back to Penn. And thank you also for all the work that you're doing at NASA. This presentation was wonderful. I guess my question may be more in the clarification category. I'm interested in how the satellite sensing is affected by the things like cloud cover. I'm thinking also about smoke that, you know, this summer we had very intense smoke up in Canada and drifting down into the States as well. Those are, you know, all of them temporary phenomenon, but I presume the satellites are coming over, you know, just mapping this on a snapshot basis. You know, I suppose to some degree, maybe we could assume that cloud cover is randomly distributed, or maybe it doesn't affect these sensors at all either. I don't. But on the other hand, when I was intrigued that we're using these sensing data then to figure out things like cloud cover. How we do that if cloud cover in the first instance had to be kind of factored out to draw the inferences that you're talking about. Anyway, I hope that's something that you could just offer by way of clarification?
I can. So different regions of the electromagnetic spectrum are sensitive to different things. Some satellites are observed in regions where they can see right through the clouds to the ground. Others, as you point out, they don't want to see through. It's the clouds that are of interest. So when you're building your instrument, you choose the appropriate region of the electromagnetic spectrum for the thing that you're interested in, which is why the selection and design of these instruments is really science driven, because they are being built to observe a certain kind of thing. And you would not use the same satellite that looks at clouds to look at the ground. Beyond that, this is part of the complexity of radiative transfer. When you're trying to map the clouds, I mean, essentially what you're doing in most of these algorithms, in order to try to infer the state of the scene from a noisy electromagnetic spectrum, is you're saying you take a first guess at what you think characterizes the scene. That's the state. Like, is it a clear scene or a cloudy scene? And then you run something called a forward model, which kind of runs in the opposite direction from what you're really trying to do, which is understand the state that gave rise to what you saw. But you also have models that will take a given state and produce a synthetic radiance vector. So all these retrieval algorithms, what they're doing is they're taking a first guess at what the state is. They're generating a synthetic radiance. They compare that synthetic radiance to the radiance that was observed, and then they try to adjust the state in order to make, through some additional number of iterations, to try to make the synthetic radiance match the observed one. And then there's all kinds, I mean, these are the sort of some of the sources of uncertainty that you get. That's an optimization problem. How do you minimize essentially the distance between the radiance vector you observed and the one that you're predicting? But how well your optimization algorithm works, when it stops, how close do you have to be in order to declare that you've gotten a match? All those things are tunable parameters in these algorithms that somebody has to set. So that's one big source of uncertainty, is have you set those things to the correct things? Not only that, that radiance that you see from the spacecraft is not only affected by the cloud that you're actually looking at, it's affected by the aerosols that are in the atmosphere. It's affected by how much carbon dioxide, all those other things. So all of that actually technically has to be part of that state. And you have to run this big complicated forward model every time you want to do an iteration of the algorithm to try to move the state closer to what you think it really is. So I guess the big answer is, depends what you're looking at. You design your instrument to be as specific as you can without being overly specific so that you can't see anything else for what you're looking for. And then you have to have this forward modeling process right. You have to have a lot of knowledge about the physics of how photons are scattered and absorbed. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, just for those of you who had some stats, you validate these things in part by backcasting. Is what, Amy was referring to. And then in case it wasn't really clear, let me emphasize that collection and monitoring of the data, organizing it, is also an AI process. So getting the data in shape to begin with requires these algorithms. Then when time comes to analyze it, you see AI enter again. Other questions? Wait till we get you. We don't want to miss a word you say. Thanks.
Could you just distinguish the new NASA satellites from what's already happening with Landsat from USGS and Sentinel from ESA?
Yeah, so ESA is the European Space Agency. Most of the world's space agencies try to coordinate a little bit so that we're not wasting resources. Landsat is, I don't actually know very much about Landsat. It's a very old instrument. I mean, they're still flying new ones. Sounds like you probably know more about Landsat than I do. I'm not sure what the spatial resolution is on Landsat. It might be quite high. Sentinel, I know a lot of people at JPL use. In fact, I know somebody that's working on a project that's using it right now. And it will be used in combination with SBG, for example. The SBG has two precursor instruments that are up right now on the International Space Station. One is called EMIT, which is the Earth Mineral Dust Investigation, which is trying to understand what regions of the Earth are sources for mineral dust that goes in the atmosphere and what are the characteristics of that mineral dust, because those are the kinds of aerosols in the atmosphere that tend to affect the radiative balance, the Earth's radiative balance. The other one is called EcoStress. The EMIT is the precursor instrument for the visible shortwave side of SBG. EcoStress is on the space station. It is the precursor instrument for the thermal instrument that SBG will be. So if you're actually interested in what SBG data might look like, that's the place to go. It's similar in spatial resolution and in its observing properties. The only thing that's not the same is that because these two are on the space station, they're kind of going like this, where SBG will go like that. So that changes things. When you go like that, you are always within 40 minutes or so of like 1 o'clock in the afternoon if you're in that in an orbit that of equator crossing. So it's always the same local time at the equator, and then it's depending on how far you go from the equator, north or south, you are things are changing a little bit. Let's just leave it at that. So the one last comment I would make is that the Europeans have an analog mission to SBG that is called CHIME, Copernicus Hyperspectral Image something. And it too is going to fly as two platforms and produce data that are similar. And in fact, the two mission teams are coordinating so that things are easily comparable and put together. And if you put the entire data collection from both of those instruments together, you're getting much faster repeat time at any location on Earth. It would be as much as 16 days for SBG alone, and it's all the way down to 5 to 7 days if you combine the other two. So does that answer your question? Kind of, or?
Yeah, I was also wondering about like the different bands and stuff. I saw on one of the slides, it mentioned like 200 bands, I think.
285 on the VSWARE.
And I think Landsat is like 13 or 15.
Yeah,
So
right.
what are
right.
those bands covering?
I would have to go back to the slide to show you exactly. I can give you the slides if you're interested, or you can just Google SBG and you'll find out. But you're right. I mean, this whole hyperspectral imaging, it's multi. If an instrument observes more than one spectral bin, it's called multispectral. So Landsat was multispectral. And when you get up into the hundreds of bins, they call that hyperspectral. It's the terminology.
Another question?
Yeah.
Yes, gentlemen.
Yes, thank you for your lecture. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
And I was wondering if you could just clarify on ML and AI. I think that's very important for many of us who are not scientists in the technical aspect of it, because often those two are confused.
Yeah.
And also, what do you make of the executive orders that President Biden signed yesterday on AI? And it's interesting you talk about collaboration, but there's still fears among nations in terms of competition, who's supposed to get there, as we've seen the race to the moon and to Mars, and just the whole ethnocentric national pride of launching these satellites and who is the pioneer, on and on and on.
Yeah. Okay, so my take from my own personal excursion to Wikipedia on AI and ML, and from what I learned from Richard here, is no universally agreed upon definition of what AI is. I think you would find more universally agreed upon, though maybe not quite entirely universally agreed upon, definitions of what machine learning is. But I like what I found on that NASA slide that said ML is part of AI. AI, when you hear the words, it makes you think of robots who are mimicking being human. It makes you think of, to me, it's automated reasoning, right? Which is different than machine learning, because machine learning is, I would call it automated pattern recognition. So recognizing a pattern in some data does not tell you how to make a decision about what you're going to do about something. It just says, here's a pattern. So I put those things on two different levels. And I think we are a very long way from actual AI, in my opinion. Now, about the executive order, I didn't actually pay a whole lot of attention to that, probably because in the environment that I work in, how do I say it? I mean, we work in a very open and collaborative way. NASA has always been open and collaborative, evidenced by the fact that anybody for no cost can get any of the data. And that personally is the mode I like to work in. It's made it a little bit difficult sometimes to collaborate with industrial partners, because often they have proprietary things and they want you to use them, but they won't tell you how they're doing it. So that's off the table. If, you know, I like to think of ourselves more as scientists and researchers and part of the global scientific and applications communities than as part of the defense industry. Now, that said, we are subject to rules about who we can collaborate with and at what level for certain countries. China, for example. There's the Congress passed a law some years back on so-called bilateral cooperation with China, which prohibits any activity that somebody like me would do with a person from the People's Republic of China alone, right? Now, it doesn't apply to Chinese graduate students in the US, because it's not just me and them, right? We can go to conferences in China. We can write papers with people in China as long as there's somebody on there from a third country. I don't know what this is supposed to accomplish, mind you, but I don't know how that protects you as intellectual property in any way, but that's the law. And we've had people fired for breaking it, so.
I read a little bit about the recent announcement by President Biden. And just one comment, and it's true of all of these discussions, AI is never defined. I don't know what they're going to be regulating. The thermostat in your home, they've been available for decades.
Right.
Under many definitions, that's AI. So we're going to regulate thermostats? I mean, it's a mess of definitions to start with.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, that gentleman in the purple shirt.
Thank you. And thank you, Amy. I have two quick questions. One's just clarifying on the ESO observations. Like, what are the frequency of those observations? Is this on an hourly level, a monthly level? And I guess that influences maybe what questions you can ask. And then the second one is also a policy question, but on the other side, how do you see the changing data collection impacting environmental policy or environmental policymakers and the decisions that they make?
Good, both good questions. So the temporal frequency of the VSWER instrument, the visible shortwave instrument, is once every 16 days at the equator. More often in locations as you go further away from the equator, because by the time you're at a very high latitude, you've got these overlapping strips that are coming very quickly. So in the mid-continent, in the middle of the US, place like Philadelphia, probably 8 days, 9 days. The thermal instrument is quicker because it's got a wider so-called swath. It's about 3 times as wide. So I think that one is like 6 to 8 days at the equator, unless as you go away. And then there's the European mission, the CHIME mission, which probably halves those times, because it's going to be in an orbit that tries not to be right on top of SBG. The good question about the policy. I mean, I suppose the vanilla answer to that is, if we if we're able to exploit all this new information, and we are likely to learn things we didn't know. And that could change how certain policy level decisions are made. That's kind of a vague answer, but maybe on a slightly less vague way, I could imagine changes to agricultural policy based on what we would learn from this. I can imagine, I think maybe the biggest one, I think, is going to be what we're going to learn about urban environments and the impact of these green spaces and the impact of decisions people make about, I guess, designing infrastructure for cities. One that particularly interests me is urban heat islands. You know, or you know, how I know there's this gentleman here was telling me how this whole enterprise here is actually in the School of Design, where they think a lot about urban planning, right? So I could see urban planning being an area where these new data might really help inform the way you design new cities or new parts of cities.
Just on that point, is there already any interaction between like what research projects are pursued and policymakers or like experimental policy making that's tied to it, if you know any of that?
Yeah, so I guess I would call it, I'm not sure I'd call it policy making as much as I call it decision making. Because those sort of things tend to be at a more granular level, right? We have a lot of wildfires in California. We already work quite closely with CAL FIRE and the LA County fire authorities. There are various research projects building these kind of dashboard systems that decision makers can go into and say, I think I better drop some phosphine over here because the fire is likely to spread from here to here. Or under what conditions are fires likely? I mean, it's obvious that when it gets hot and windy, there's a big wildfire danger, but over a longer term where things get dried out, that's going to be a place where you're going to worry about fires. There are water in California is also a big one. Is there likely to be a drought? How the relationship between the Sierra snowpack and water availability in Los Angeles? And there are other examples in other cities of those sorts of things. So I'm not sure I have the knowledge to comment on policy, but on decision making, I think, yes, that's already underway.
Thank you, Dr. Braverman. I appreciate it, the talk. And one of the applications, which I think might be helpful in answering the previous question, is agricultural practices. And one of the applications for satellite data that I've seen, remote sensing data and machine learning, is in the sequestration of carbon in soil, and using regenerative agriculture practices to promote increased sequestration. So the practice is the observation of that carbon, because taking ground truth data, soil samples is not, it's not scalable. It's too cost prohibitive. So I guess what I'm asking is if you could opine on the effectiveness of the remote sensing data to capture that observation of the carbon in soil, which is, it has to capture it at very, very, it has to be incredibly sensitive to be able to capture that, is my understanding.
Interesting point that you bring up. There is talk at JPL now of a new mission to measure soil organic carbon, which somebody thinks can be done. I don't know enough about it to opine too much, except to say that it's on the list of things that people would like to get funded for exactly the reason that you're talking about. There's already a mission that's doing, well, soil moisture is probably relevant for agriculture, but not for carbon sequestration particularly. There's already a mission up there now called SMAP, which is soil moisture active passive, that's studying some aspects of soil properties, but not the full-on organic carbon. I'll let you know. Come talk to me. I'll let you know what I can find out.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
being modeled now. I
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
don't know if the sensitivity, if the, yeah, I mean, I guess the sensitivity is as fine as it needs to be.
Yeah, so one point about that, right? So you have to be able to build an instrument that sees in the right part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And then you have to have that forward model that you're going to use in your attempt to pull out the thing you care about. People do like to talk about machine learning versions of these retrieval algorithms, right? If you could get a training set together that express the relationship between certain electromagnetic spectra and the soil carbon properties, and if you could get a training set together that was rich enough, then presumably you could use that. But like you say, I'm skeptical of that, because without going out and collecting soil samples and taking them back to the lab, I don't know how you would do it. And you can't probably get enough of them to make that viable. So I don't know.
Yeah, machine learning depends fundamentally on data,
Yeah.
which sometimes people overlook.
Mhm.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for your talk. Wanted to ask, so I'm curious about the tension between machine learning and the hope of using this like technology and the applications that we can get out of this for decision-making applications. And so you mentioned that JPL is working on capturing and quantifying uncertainties, and I'm curious what that process looks like.
That's in her sweet spot.
Yeah. That's my shtick now. I have multiple whole other talks on how we're trying to do that. How can I say it without putting everyone to sleep immediately? So we take when it's convenient to call it a machine learning approach, I sometimes do for certain audiences, but I think of it more as a statistical problem. And it's machine learning-y in the sense that what we do is we need to understand the relationship between our true state. If you remember my slide that had the little diagram across the top, and its estimate. And what we're really interested in is that statistical relationship. And we want to learn that somehow, and then apply what we learn to the state estimates that these algorithms produce. So one way to do that, and it felt like the most effective way to do that, was to run a very comprehensive simulation experiment that used synthetic true states, let's say an ensemble of synthetic true states that are, in our opinion, representative of all the kinds of situations we're actually going to see with our mission. And use the best forward model we have to turn those into these radiance vectors, add some measurement error, because we know from the laboratory what the measurement error characteristics of the instruments are likely to be, and then put that directly into our operational processing system, and what will pop out will be an estimate of the true state. So what we have, every time we do that, every time we take an input of a synthetic true state and we run it through this thing, what comes out is a corresponding estimate. And if we do that over this ensemble of potential true states, then we think we can learn the relationship between the input and the output. And we use a technique called Gaussian mixture modeling for that. But you can think of it like a regression on steroids. So now what I've got is I've got enough information. I've got X and I've got X hat, and I'm going to build a regression model, in my case, non-linear and non-Gaussian, but regression model nonetheless, to get the conditional probability distribution of the true state given the retrieved state. So when a real retrieved state comes along, I'll just plug it in and I'll get a point prediction of what the true state is that went with that. But I will also be able to get a distribution around it, because in regression, you can get think it's is it a tolerance interval or confidence, something about that. You can get the conditional distribution of the true state given the retrieved state. So that's how we're doing it. And it's not a perfect solution, of course, because everything really depends on getting that initial true state ensemble to be truly representative of what the real instrument is going to see. But, you know, what is it Ralph Kahn used to say? The other thing he said, at NASA, we have a will-do attitude. We will do something. And if we can do something better, we'll do that. But we got to do something. So that's what we're doing. Yeah.
Another question.
Yeah.
Yes. Over here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I really, really enjoyed it. This also kind of stays on the topic of uncertainty, but as you mentioned, the main thing that's changing is that we've got much higher volumes and much higher resolutions of data. And this very much counters the large amounts of simplification and parameterization that happens in a lot of modeling today. But to raise a discrete example, for example, in GCMs or kind of circulation models that take into account the 3D structure of both the atmosphere and the oceans, there is a very low definition of data, especially in the lower stratosphere as well as the deep oceans because of the lack of data. And I was wondering, you know, with this increased resolution, how much of this increase in data can mitigate or improve upon this lack of resolution that we have today, while understanding that there is still a lot of, as you mentioned, uncertainty issues that we have yet to resolve. Sorry if that was a little bit convoluted.
No, that's okay. I think there are generally two primary uses of observational data in the climate modeling enterprise. One is for parameterizations, which is this idea that because the model runs at a coarse resolution, you cannot capture the physics of what clouds are doing at very fine resolutions. So you do statistical representations. So if you have higher resolution data, presumably you might get better statistical representations. Now, I don't know because averaging is such a violent thing to do to data, right? The other area is in using these higher resolution observations to try to, as something to compare the climate model output to. And because the climate models run at coarse scale resolution, I think some of them are running at much finer resolution these days, like kilometer resolution. But these new data at 30-meter resolution are going to be much higher. So you could simply average things with the understanding that if you're averaging 30-meter data to 1 kilometer resolution, you're doing less violence to your data than if you're averaging 30-meter data to 10-kilometer resolution or half-degree resolution. I would think, I'll add a third thing well, number one, there's a lot of good things that could be done by smart statisticians, which I'm assuming you're one because of the way you asked that question, to find methods maybe for preserving some of that fine scale information in a way that is useful at the coarser scales. That kind of goes straight to this idea of representing fine scale behavior at global scales. Another role for these observations is to simply learn more about the geophysical phenomena, right? What can these data tell us that we don't already understand about how clouds form? Or, I mean, I have colleagues who like to say, well, we know everything, don't worry about that. We know how that works, but I'm not convinced that they necessarily do in every way. So I think the much finer spatial scale resolution for certain processes will teach us more about what the underlying physical mechanisms are than the coarser scale data.
Could I follow up slightly with that? Something that I also personally grapple with is this almost seeming tension of more data and more resolution, more understanding of the underlying mechanisms, and also possible model noise. So it almost like, I don't know whether it's like right for me to say this, but almost figures in my head that there's a reason why we collect data at much lower resolutions for the lower stratosphere, because it's just less relevant. But then there's also a lot of emerging literature that's showing that there's a lot of possibly interesting things happening between the troposphere and the stratosphere, for example, that it's worth looking into. I was wondering what your opinion on like that tension might be.
Yeah, great point. Maybe you're a smart climate scientist, not a smart statistician. I don't know. You sound like you know about both. Yeah, so often people just try to observe at the finest spatial resolution that they possibly can. And as you say, that's not true for everything, because there are some processes that you're just not getting much if you observe at a finer resolution, right? With the atmosphere, I think people like high vertical resolution much more than high spatial resolution, right? So I think you're right that there is reason to worry about how accurate your physical models are. The term that comes to mind in the uncertainty quantification area that we work with is model discrepancy, which is, nature's doing what nature's doing, and we like to think of there being some so-called true forward model as distinct from the models we actually use in day-to-day life, or that we have to use in our production pipeline, which are, we'll call them, there are working forward models. There's what we understand. And while people think they're pretty good, they're not perfect, and we know it. And there's a lot of work to be done in trying to understand the nature of that discrepancy. That's the model discrepancy problem. And I would imagine that if we did understand that for certain kinds of forward models, then that really would have an impact on the resolutions at which you choose to observe and how much data you think you need to draw a particular conclusion. In the meantime, if we had good uncertainties on the data that we have, or the data that we have from remote sensing, then you could do more sophisticated statistical things to try to understand whether your model is producing something that comes to within the uncertainty of the observational data of what we see. So that's not really an answer to your question, but it's a couple of opinions about things you didn't ask about. Okay, very good.
Questions?
Mhm.
Already had a shot. I'll let you come back.
Yeah.
The gentleman there.
Yeah. Mhm.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. I just had a quick question regarding the video on ESO. So in the video, it's stated that this technology could potentially be used to see things underground, like regarding earthquakes, and also with groundwater. I was wondering if this technology could be used to find, for example, loads of lithium, for example. And if so, how would NASA prevent this technology from being, how would they make sure that this technology is used responsibly if it was able to X-ray under the ground to find these loads?
Yeah, so I'm not aware of any lithium detecting missions or instruments that are in existence now. It goes back to this question of all we're really getting is spectra, and how you would turn a spectrum like that into a detection of underground lithium. And people do use remote sensing data to try to identify promising places to dig for stuff. The intellectually sensitive part of that is how you convert the spectrum into the lithium. We don't do a perfect job of that even for things that we understand very well, like clouds, right? So that, if such a thing existed, and it wouldn't have to exist within NASA, that could be a university person's proprietary algorithm that they want to use that way. there are undoubtedly, well, for NASA, there certainly are restrictions on the export of technology to unfriendly countries, and anybody who developed an algorithm like that would be prohibited from exporting it to probably China and North Korea and Iran and places like that. So I'm not sure it's within NASA's purview to prevent that. If some individual at a university or a company invents that methodology, that would be the Department of Defense or the Department of Commerce who would have to intercede to prevent that from being given out. And depends what you mean by responsibly there. What would be an irresponsible use of that?
Like you said, it could see things underground, like with regard to like earthquakes and stuff. So I was just wondering, like, if like somebody would be able to like upload something to this and then like find things. Yeah, so you'd have to be able to find the things. Well, different technologies for that. The earthquake technology is something called synthetic aperture radar, which actually only observes the surface and maybe just a little ways down. It doesn't go very far down. But from earthquake models, you can kind of infer what's going on underneath from very minute changes in surface deformation. For water, that is detected, underground water is detected by a mission called GRACE, of which there is a new version coming up for ESO, which is really pretty clever. It was on 60 Minutes some time back. I'm sure you could find that on YouTube. It's two platforms that fly a known distance apart from each other, and they know how far apart they are because they talk to each other with a laser. And where there's more water under the ground, the Earth has more mass, and these things move minutely further apart or closer together depending on that. So that's one of those things where I say, really? You really can infer that? You can infer how much water's under there, but it appears to work. So it's you have to know a lot to be able to make use of these sorts of things.
We are sadly out of time.
Wow.
It went fast.
Yeah.
Dr. Braverman will hang around for a bit if there are a few other questions or people would just like to say hello. Thank you very much for your attendance and your spectacular questions.
Thank you.